This year, I got to check off one of my biggest theater bucket list items and attend my first ever Edinburgh Fringe. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Edinburgh Fringe is this huge fringe festival that happens every year in the month of August in Scotland, where over 3,000 different shows come and perform for the entire month. As somebody who loves to see as much theater as possible, it is literally theater going heaven, and there's so many exciting new and in development works happening at this Fringe festival. There are shows that start at the Fringe that go on to become classics on Broadway, like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, or most recently Six. There are shows that end up becoming picked up as television series, like Fleabag and Baby Reindeer. So I have been so excited to go to this, and it finally happened. I was able to attend for 8 days as a theater critic. I saw 50 shows, and here are all of my reviews ranked in order from 49 to 1 because I did go see a show more than once. Ironically, didn't even make the top 10, but we'll get to it. Before I get started, however, if this is your first time seeing me, I am Kate Ranking. I am a content creator and theater critic primarily on TikTok, but I am going to start doing some more long form content. So if that is your jam, go ahead and hit that subscribe button because I love talking about theater because theater is life. All right, let's dive in. Why not? Starting at the bottom, unfortunately, is Drop Dead Gorgeous. Now, full disclosure, Drop Dead Gorgeous was not a full production. This was a concert presentation of a select songs from a in development musical based off of Drop Dead Gorgeous, the film. These songs are written by Riki Lindhome, who is half of Garfunkel and Oates. She's incredibly funny. This film is incredibly funny. So this was definitely high on my most anticipated list of the Fringe, but this was such a disappointment. Drop Dead Gorgeous is a 1999 film about these Midwestern teenagers preparing for a beauty pageant. It had an all-star cast of like Amy Adams' film debut, Kirsten Dunst, Allison Janney. Like, we're talking amazing stars, really fun, dry, sarcastic humor that had like this level of sweetness to it because of course we have these teenage girls, but there's also a darkness to it, like teenage girls are literally dropping dead. The entire film is mockumentary style, and so I always knew if they adapted this into a musical, that would be a challenge, but that was not really my main issue with this concert presentation, where it really was just the songs. The biggest thing, however, is how distinct the humor is in this film to really being the heart of the movie, and that is really what I wanted to see captured in a musical adaptation, and that could definitely be present in the songs. And some of the songs were funny, but not in the same style of humor, and the jokes never elevated, right? They were like one really funny line, and then that's kind of where the songs peaked. There was also a lot of ballads, and the ballads were humorless, which is where the musical adaptation of this film is really going to have to be able to walk that fine line, because there are sweet and tender moments to the movie, but they are also incredibly sad and funny. Like the moments where Kirsten Dunst's character is like tap dancing in a morgue as she is preparing for this pageant. Like, that is incredibly funny. And there is a song that kind of captures that moment, but the song is really just slow and boring and just has almost too much heart, but not enough of the humor aspect to it. And that's kind of what I was looking for from this adaptation. And I know that Riki Lindhome as a writer understands the humor that is present in this movie because she had it in all of her narration where she was setting up each of the songs, but none of that is present in the musical numbers as is. And that's kind of what I'm waiting for. So right now, this is definitely at the bottom. I'm leaving this as unrated because it's definitely a work in progress. But what I'm really looking for is the signs that the musical that will be written is going to capture that spirit, and right now that's not there in anything that's been formally written other than the setups for this specific concert. Just a huge disappointment, unfortunately. Moving up to show number 48, we have This Is Not Romeo and Juliet, which I am also leaving unrated because I have no idea what was happening in this show. This was a piece of physical theater from a Danish theater company where you had 3 couples on stage. 2 of them were an older couple that were playing instruments the entire time. You had the middle couple that was like a more mature couple. They had a very sexual energy to them. They would often be naked on stage. They would run across the stage, have like this very like physical energy to them. They also were the only characters that ever spoke, just speaking their names, Romeo and Juliet, throughout the show. And then there was a younger couple who were a little more childlike, a little more innocent. They were definitely the more shy couple, very unsure of their bodies. They would often giggle embarrassingly, and these characters would all interact with each other. The middle couple throughout the show would get the younger couple to open up and to mature a little bit, and that is basically where my understanding of the show ends, because other than that, I had no idea what was going on. This was very much a non-verbal show, other than saying Romeo and Juliet over and over again. It went on so long, and I was so lost. This show truly felt like if SNL was tasked with writing what they thought was the most stereotypical Fringe show, and this is what they came up with. That's what this felt like. Definitely not my thing. I'm sure there was a deeper meaning I just was not understanding, but for that reason, I'm definitely leaving this unrated and near the bottom of this list. Now, moving up to the 2-star shows. These had moments that were intriguing, maybe an interesting concept here and there, but for the most part just did not work for me at all. And unfortunately, we have to start with number 47, You and It. This is a piece of Korean theater about a husband who tragically loses his expecting wife in an accident and replaces her with an AI replacement. She does not realize that she is AI. And where this show began to lose me is that we as the audience, in the writing of the script, are also unsure of what she is. The AI aspect is left a mystery. However, they used AI in the tagline for the show, which was, you will learn to love again, with AI capitalized. So the big twist was essentially spoiled from the moment we walked into the theater. If you paid attention to the marketing elements, which I'm sure there are people that walked in that weren't, and I'm curious about how they thought of the writing. But that was a huge miss for me, and especially because I think that this show would have such a more intriguing direction if we as the audience were brought into the husband's point of view of being aware that she's AI and seeing everything that he's trying to do to keep her from realizing that, as opposed to being in the wife's point of view and being unsure of who exactly she was. And I do think it's a very interesting premise. We've seen this in other works of art. Black Mirror had an episode that was very much like a loved one being replaced with a robot alternative. And so I think as a concept it works, but the execution just was not there. The direction was also very, at times, laughably working against the text, where there were sound effects and movement choices that were so over dramatic that they took away the emotional impacts of those moments. Like when the woman gets hit by a car and the sound effect is just so comically over the top. It sounds more in line with a cartoon than with a serious piece of dramatic theater. At number 46, we have Come Dine With Me, which is a musical adaptation of the reality show of the same name. Now, in this reality show, contestants come together to cook each other meals and then rank their meals anonymously. And this musical actually took the really interesting point of view of focusing primarily on the crew that helps to make this reality show. So our leading characters were the sound guy and the camera guy and the producer, which I thought was a really unique perspective to take for a musical based off of a reality show. However, it still fell into the pitfalls that a lot of these reality show adaptations fall into, where every single contestant got their own solo number. However, in this case, because the contestants were not the primary focus of the show, we just ended up not caring about the solo numbers at all. I wanted more of the main characters who were the crew. This show also focused on this crew preparing for the reality show's 1000th episode and making sure that it was a great night of television. However, there was somebody that was sabotaging all of the dinners, and because of the writing, it was kind of confusing on what exactly the stakes were. Were we wanting to find out who the saboteur is? Was that a mystery, or did we not want to find out who the saboteur was because they were creating good television and that would create an exciting 1000th episode? It seemed unsure who we were rooting for in this musical. And then on top of that, just every single song stopped the momentum, and the songwriting was just leaving something to be desired. I did not enjoy a single musical number in this show, which was unfortunate because I do think that the concept on the surface is intriguing. Moving to number 45, the greatest musical the world has ever seen. Now, this is a one-man show written and performed by Matt Howie. Matt plays a young man, Randy Thatcher. Now, Randy Thatcher definitely has some social anxieties. He's kind of an outcast at school, and he has written a musical that he's super passionate about an alien who's on an alien planet and is just going through life, has to deal with intergalactic war and a love interest and friendships. And it definitely does not have anything to do with his real life. He will keep on insisting, but it definitely is reflecting his own life. Musical theater writing to him has become an outlet of sorts for him. Think of like if Evan Hansen was told to write musicals as opposed to writing letters to himself. And that is a fantastic concept. Truly loved it. And throughout the show, he is presenting his concept for this musical that he thinks is going to be the greatest musical the world has ever seen. At the same time, he is waiting to hear back from a musical theater program that he has applied to with the presentation of this musical. And he's really, really hoping to get into this. And he thinks that, you know, all of his problems are going to be solved if he gets into this school. And so his pitch for this musical is broken up by the calls from the school, calls from his mom, checking in to see if he's heard back yet. And that is kind of where the momentum of the show starts to falter a little bit. The performances in these pre-recorded messages kind of drags down the quality, the overall quality of the show. They feel very amateurish, and especially in contrast with Matt's performance, that's very raw and vulnerable. The pre-recorded voice elements just felt very fake. And so every one of those would kind of drag the show down. This musical also has a fine line to walk, right? Because of course the reality of the matter is that Randy Thatcher is not God's gift to musical theater. He is not the next Sondheim, and as the show goes on, he realizes that maybe he's putting too much pressure on himself for this first musical to be perfect. And because of that, the writing in the musical is intentionally not the greatest. However, in order for that to work and for that to be clear, the rest of the book of the show needs to be great. We have to be invested in Randy Thatcher as a character. And that for me was just missing. It was overall hard to get invested in his story because you have an intentionally kind of weaker musical score with a book that didn't quite stick the landing for me. But ultimately, I do think that this concept of being able to talk about how much pressure that we put on ourselves to make sure that our art, especially when we're just starting out, is perfect, is a great concept. And I would love to see the show explore that a little more while strengthening the real life aspects of the show. And at number 44, maybe a little controversially, I have VL. VL is a new comedy play by Kieran Hurley and Gary McNair, who also wrote Square Go, which apparently happens in the same universe. I did not see Square Go, but I did not enjoy a single second of this show. Now, VL is a play about these two teenage boys, and one of them is very anxious about people finding out that he is a VL, virgin lips. He has never been kissed. And so much of this play takes you through why he's worried about that, how he's going to fix this, who he's going to go out and kiss. And it ends up just being an hour of these two boys essentially bullying themselves. I would have hoped that this show would have gotten to the point where they really talk about the fact that it doesn't matter how you progress sexually in your teenage years, and it really never did that. It ended with them still making fun of each other. And one of the things about VL as a show is that this was a crowd favorite. Like, I went into this with people talking about how much they loved it, how funny it was, and I maybe laughed once in this show. It could not have been further to my sense of humor if it tried. Every single joke just felt very immature. It was like I was back in middle school, which I don't know about you, but I never want to do. And I found absolutely no enjoyment in watching these boys bully each other for a whole hour. I was unsure what this show was trying to say or how it was making the world a better place. It just almost felt like it was okay that these boys went through this. And I will say that the character work done by both of these men was incredibly well done. They embodied so many different characters. Their comic timing was really, really great. And the audience truly loved this show. But I personally just could not wait to leave. This is definitely an enjoyable show for anybody who finds this kind of humor funny. Now moving up into the 3-star shows. These are shows that definitely need a lot of work, but I found aspects at least still enjoyable. And at number 43, we have House of Cleopatra. House of Cleopatra is a musical that has been in development for a while. There's actually a concept recording out that you can listen to called Cleopatra, the Musical Experience, from a production that they did in New York. It has this fantastic club score written by Laura Kleinbaum and Jeff Day, and the entire show takes place during the final 3 days of Cleopatra's reign, set in a club party atmosphere because Cleopatra, of course, loved to throw these very extravagant parties for her people. And this, in fact, is the show that I went to go see twice. And yes, it still is in the bottom 10, but we'll talk about it. Overall, I thought this was an incredibly fun time and an interesting concept. I don't necessarily think all the aspects of the concept work, but I love this idea of having an immersive piece of theater where the audience is essentially at a party the entire time. I love theater that kind of explores ways that we view theater and experience it. And this show had the audience standing the entire show. We were free to move around. The bar was open for the entirety of the experience. Me and my friends were like in a corner dancing along to the songs. And some of the songs can be repetitive because they're written like pop songs that you would hear in a club setting. So there's a lot of lyrics that are repeated over and over again, but because of the immersion of the show, I don't mind it as much because the expectation, at least from what I understand, is that the audience should not be standing there and watching this show like a normal piece of theater. We should be grooving along to it and having a party like Cleopatra expected us to. But the show runs into a couple issues, and one is the fact that it does go to some darker places. I mean, this is, a time of war. Cleopatra is dealing with the attacks that have been happening. And of course, by the end of the show, spoiler alert, she does die, which is historical fact. And so to be able to balance some of the slower and more dramatic songs with the fact that we as audience are supposed to be enjoying that, that's kind of where this show has a lot of trouble. And a lot of that I think can be solved in the direction. Now, the direction of this show is done by Christopher D. Clegg, and the direction of this production was just where this show was a huge miss for me because I had a really good time, but I knew what to expect going in. I knew what Cleopatra was as a show, that it was kind of immersive, that we were all going to be standing the entire time. And the first time I went, I also went with friends who had seen this previously in New York. And so we were in a corner, we were dancing, we were having a good time. The rest of the audience was definitely older. There were a lot of critics in the audience, and they were just kind of standing there and not interacting with it because it's definitely not clear how the audience is supposed to interact with it in this production. The cast is going in and out of the audience and walking through, but we're never encouraged as audience members to participate other than a little brief moment at the beginning. And you could tell that the audience as a whole was unsure, which is why I wanted to go back. I wanted to experience it again with a younger audience and see if the vibes got a little better, if people were more open to dancing along and interacting with the show. And the second time I went, there was in fact a younger audience and the interactions were worse. I was the only person dancing along. It became very clear to me that this production just did not know how to incorporate the audience effectively. There were some good parts about this production. production, especially some of the vocalists, like Emily Louise Israel, who played Cleopatra, and Harry Singh as Octavio. But there were definitely also some performances that were pitchy both times that I saw it. And especially when the entire production primarily relies on the score, that was kind of difficult to sit through. Overall, I think the show has huge potential to be a highly enjoyable experience. It just needs completely new direction. The audience needs to be aware of what kind of show they're seeing, and their expectations need to be clearly set. And I also think that the tone of the show needs to go in a completely different direction so that the more dramatic moments of this show are still enjoyable for the immersive setting that it's taking place in. If the show can completely lean into camp and the drama of it, that it will be an enjoyable experience for the entire audience, which right now it just was not. At number 42, we have Willy's Candy Spectacular. Now, Willy's Candy Spectacular is a musical inspired by the disaster that was the Willy's Candy Spectacular in Glasgow last year, where kids went to go experience this and ended up in an empty warehouse being given 2 jelly beans, being scared by the unknown. That event now turned into a musical with 10 different musical writers, 2 book writers, and a cast of actors that spanned from like Broadway performers to the real Kirsty Peterson, who was the actual sad Oompa Loompa at that Glasgow event, to actors who were in the original Willy Wonka film. Like, the cast was just insane. There was also a really fun immersive element where we had scratch and sniff cards that we would scratch off at certain points. And the show started off so promising with this really fun title number that kind of set the scene for almost a musical tonally similar to Little Shop of Horrors, where potentially Willy's Candy Spectacular led to like the end times, which I thought would be such a fun direction to take this in. And then the musical did not go in that direction at all. Willy's Candy Spectacular definitely felt like a case of having too many cooks in the kitchen, where we had all of these musical theater writers and none of them were writing for the same musical. A lot of jokes about how AI wrote the script for the event in Glasgow, but I'm not unconvinced that AI wouldn't have written a better script for this musical, because it was just all over the place. I have no idea what this was trying to be about. There were bits about Kirsty Patterson having to watch actresses play her while she was on stage. I'm not sure what the intent of that was. There were bits about maybe the child actually enjoyed it. AI was also a character, and I'm not sure why she was. I was so confused about where this show wanted to go, but the songs were actually kind of enjoyable musical theater songs, especially the title number, which I need a cast recording of immediately. It's just so catchy. Willy's Candy Spectacular. No, 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 no. And I definitely think that there's an interesting concept for this musical if it can lean into the story that is set up in that opening number. But right now it was just a mess on multiple levels. At 41, we have Tiny Little Town, which is a new musical by Theater Movement Bazaar based off of Gogol's The Inspector General. Similar to Inspector General, Tiny Little Town follows essentially the same plot, where a town with a corrupt mayor find out that an inspector is coming, but that he is in a disguise and cannot say that he's the inspector. And so they find who they think is the inspector and try to suck up and bribe him in order to pass this inspection. The man that they find, however, is actually a criminal on the run from all of the debts that he has acquired, he kind of just goes along for the ride. Now, Theater Movement Bazaar really leans into the absurdity and the physicality in their productions, and the choreography and the movement in this show are so sharp that they really increase the absurdity of this entire plot beautifully. Tina Kronos, who both directed and choreographed this, did such a great job, and it is really the reason to see any Theater Movement Bazaar production. They constantly excel in this. There was also a lot of really great performances, a lot of really fantastic vocals, but ultimately, however, the source material for me just leaves something to be desired. The challenge in having a story with a lot of corrupt characters is that you need somebody to root for. There still has to be a heart to it, and that for me was kind of missing. You know, like in shows with con men like Music Man, you're still rooting for Harold Hill. And in this, I just was not rooting for anybody, which kind of made it hard to watch at times. But if you ever get a chance to see a Theater Movement Bazaar production, they just really excel with the movement in their shows. And that was definitely present here, and I cannot wait to see what they do next. And if you're a fan of this source material, there's actually a lot to love in this production. At number 40, we have The Gardening Club, which is unique in that it is essentially a 2-act in development musical, but they only brought the first act to Fringe. It's a new musical written by Bella Wright and Carly McRitchie, who are these new young musical theater writers who I think have a ton of promise. And the entire musical takes place in the 1960s and follows this group of 6 women as they form essentially an illegal drug ring to smuggle birth control, because at the time, the only women who could get birth control were married women. And so they get the pills from their married friend and distribute them to all of the unmarried women in their town. Already starting off with a really fun and really relevant concept. And the songwriting, again, shows a lot of promise. There's a lot of really fun lyrics in this. I really liked the music. It all had this like kind of doo-wop pop sound to it that really belonged in the time period. I definitely don't think that shows always need to sound like the time period that they take place in, but when they do, it makes me so happy. And I think that this show does a really great job of not shying away from talking about sex. Oftentimes when we talk about shows that take place in the 1950s and 60s, we think of them as very like chaste, and this show did not shy away at all from being very sexual. And you have these characters that are very open with how they talk about sex, including their overall enjoyment and some of their struggles. And it also included ace representation, which just made me really incredibly happy. I have been trying to find a musical with explicit ace representation that isn't like SpongeBob SquarePants for so long. And so it was like a breath of fresh air to see what I think is ace representation in this show. I'm not sure, however, where that character goes in the second act, and if that was just kind of alluded to in the first act but isn't actual ace representation. I really want to see the second act of this show. Now, The Gardening Club shows a lot of promise, but don't get me wrong, it needs a ton of development still, not just in, an entire second act, but also in tonally finding its footing. The characters definitely need to be refined. There are almost too many characters. We have the men of the village, the women of the village. All of the women have their own struggles and their own personalities, and the arcs that all of the women go through, I don't think all are necessary to the main through line of the show. And there are moments in this that are just really over the top and silly, and I found myself laughing maybe where I shouldn't have been laughing. But then there were also moments that were intentionally over the top. You had lyrics like the men singing, "My life is hard, but I am harder," which is a ridiculous lyric and so funny. But then you had a lot of more dramatic, more serious moments. And I definitely think the show can have both, but right now it just feels dissonant throughout. I, as an audience member, felt unsure of what exactly I was supposed to be laughing at and what exactly I was laughing because it was unintentionally funny. But if the show can figure out its overall tone and finish the second act, I'm excited for this. I think there's a lot of promise here. At number 39, we have FAMEHUNGRY, which was a piece of performance art performed by Louise Irwin, entirely live streamed on her TikTok channel. As a TikTok creator myself, I was definitely gravitated towards seeing this show, and I was excited to see what she explored in her production. And she would go live every performance from start to finish and perform essentially the same script that would be projected behind her for only the live in-person audience to see. And there was also some commentary that we would get to see in the live audience, as well as we could see a projection of her live stream and all of the comments that were coming in. During her live stream, she would also talk to Jax Valentine, who is a content creator with 80,000 followers, who has been creating content on TikTok since she was a young teenager. And she has become sort of a mentor to Louise, who is a millennial in her 30s. And so they talked a little bit about the generational differences. It also explored a lot of what she thinks the algorithm will promote. And it went into some really interesting places about kind of some of the darker aspects of the internet, like Jax talking about her experience being more popular as a young teenager before she turned 18 than afterwards. What this show was missing for me, however, was that it misses such a huge aspect of TikTok as a platform, and that is engagement. And it makes sense for me that this is kind of where the show is lacking, because even Louise's mentor Jax doesn't have really high engagement on a page with as many followers as she does. One thing that makes lives on TikTok so fascinating for the audience to watch is how the creators interact with the people in the comments. Louise, however, never once acknowledged the comments that were coming in, and some of them were like mean and some of them were encouraging. She would set goals for her audience. Like every day, the viewers on TikTok were told that if she got a certain amount of likes, she would do something special. She would never say what that was, and the days that I watched, she would actually hit that goal almost too soon to where it is programmed in the script. But Louise never really acknowledged any of the comments. She never responded to them, which is something that every single TikTok creator, for the most part, that is getting these millions of followers does. They interact with people, they go live and they open up their space and they're vulnerable and they answer questions and they respond to comments. Even people that go on TikTok live to just act as like non-playable characters will react to gifts that they're getting. And we did not see that here, which is such a huge miss for me, because that is what makes TikTok such a great platform, is the community that you build with your channel. And because she was going through the same script every day, it lacked the fluidity that you have on TikTok. Just an interesting concept that for me completely misses the point of what makes TikTok so great. At number 38, we have Giant on the Bridge, which is a piece of devised theater created in conjunction with Distant Voices, who are a group of songwriters that go to prisons and do songwriting workshops with the prisoners. And Giant on the Bridge specifically focuses on stories and songs about prisoners returning home. And we get to see these stories and songs from multiple point of views, from the prisoner himself to his family members to somebody who represents one of these songwriters who does these workshops. And all of these spoken word elements and stories and songs are woven together into this singular piece. The songs in Giant on the Bridge are fantastic, and Distant Voices actually has a few EPs out, and some of these songs are featured on those EPs, like Autopilot and Everything's Spherical. Where the show kind of fell apart for me was that the spoken word elements really halted the momentum, and oftentimes they were reiterating aspects that were already present in the lyrics of the songs or were going to be present in the songs, and the songs themselves were just so much more successful at relaying these feelings and these emotions that the spoken word just ended up kind of falling flat. I do think, however, that there is an incredibly important and really emotional show in here. If the book of this can just be revised for future versions, because the songs are just so good. I almost would have just liked this better as a concert. At number 37, we have Influenced. Influenced is a one-man show written and performed by Mark Twain, and it follows Eric, who's an influencer with 5 million followers who is performing for the first time in front of a live in-person audience. And during his performance, he takes you through his origins and what influenced him and how he got into this and how he gained his following. And as it goes on, you realize that maybe he's not somebody that you should look up to. This show does such a great job of making Eric such a sympathetic character right off the bat. You want to follow him. You're like, yeah, I love this guy. He's relatable. Thanks to Mark Twain's performance, you are drawn into him immediately. You are rooting for this guy. And the show as a whole does such a great job of showing how easy it is to be influenced by personalities who we know kind of nothing about, just what they are choosing to show us. And the entire show leads as a warning to all of the men who are being influenced by, you know, the Andrew Tates of the world. The concept is just so good, and Mark Twain's performance is fantastic. the show just for me does not stick the landing quite right. I think overall the writing, especially in the back half of this play, needs a lot of development, and I would love to see this go either in a full horror direction or to open up and expand and include more characters. Right now, Eric kind of almost has a redemption arc that I don't ever think is earned in the play as it is. And I don't necessarily think it would be a bad thing to give him a redemption arc, but I just don't think that right now, with the framing device of this being, you know, one night, I just don't think that that ending lands the way that it wants to right now. And in fact, Influenced, I almost wonder how it would work as a live streamed performance. But I am really intrigued by Mark Twain's writing, and I'm really excited to see what he develops in the future. Keep an eye out for him. A really great concept, and I think that if this gets some more development, can definitely be something important in the future. At number 36, we have Birdwatching, which is a horror play. I love horror plays. I think horror is incredibly difficult to do in theater. And Birdwatching follows these three friends who go camping, and each of them has their own insecurities, and they feel like they are being watched for different reasons. And so much of their experience going camping is feeling that there's something out there watching them, which I think is a really intriguing and effective concept for not just incorporating the horror elements, but also dissecting the insecurities that we have, especially as teenagers, and some of the paranoia that surrounds that. And each of the characters has such a beautifully specific aspect to them. You have the person who feels like she is constantly being watched and sexualized because of the way that she looks. You have the queer person who is not quite out of the closet or feels like they're being judged for their queerness. You have the neurodivergent character who feels like an outsider because they don't feel like they are either masking properly or fit in with society. And each of those characterizations works perfectly for really exploring this idea of being perceived and the way that we're perceived. Now, like I said, however, horror is incredibly difficult to do in theater, and especially when that theater is really just a conference room in a hotel, it can be hard to do that effectively. I would love to see this in an actual black box space where they can do some of the more technical elements. I also think that while each of the three characters has such a really specific point of view, they're not all fleshed out the same way, and I would love to see all three of them kind of be on an equal playing field, because I think all three characters are so distinct and add to the overall concept so well. But Birdwatching is a very, very, very promising piece of horror theater, and I cannot wait to see where this ends up. Especially if you are a fan of horror and want to see it done effectively in theater, there is so much potential here for this to do that. Now, moving into the 4-star category, that is right, we are at number 35, which means over half of these shows that I saw at Fringe were 4 stars and above, which is like incredible. These are shows that I really thought were well constructed, well put together, well performed. They just need just a little more development to take them into that 5-star category. And at number 35, we have Is the Wi-Fi Good in Hell? Is the Wi-Fi Good in Hell is a one-man show written and performed by Lyndon Chapman, all about his time growing up in Margate, realizing that he was gay, not knowing any other gay people, and really feeling like an outsider because of that, moving to London, finding a community, but not really ever finding himself, finding how to make himself palatable to all of the different circles that he's in. And then by the time he returns to Margate, Margate has become kind of a trending city. It has changed so much since he was last there. And it explores some of the parallels between, you know, seeing the town that he grew up in change and become trendy, but also seeing queerness become kind of a trendy thing. Is the Wi-Fi Good in Hell definitely really benefits from a fantastic performance by Lyndon Chapman. The writing in this is also really good. There's a really beautiful sequence where he takes you through all of the different voices that he uses depending on social situations that he's in. And I think it explores a really important topic of this kind of experience that a lot of millennials go through, where they're still in social circles foremost as a lot of Gen Z queers, but they also have this experience of growing up in the early 2000s when gay was still an insult that was commonly used in media, when being queer wasn't nearly as accepted as it is today. And obviously we still have a lot of work to go through, especially if you're trans, but so much has happened between the time when Lyndon was growing up to now, and this play really explores all of that. As an outsider who was never a gay man, and as an American, there was a lot of this play that I did just not understand the nuances of. But I do not think this play was intended for me, and nor do I think it has to. I think that what this show does, it does very successfully. Just as an outsider, there's not much to enjoy about it, other than a couple key moments. Is the Wi-Fi Good in Hell feels like a play for people who experience the specific time period, as opposed to looking at more of the universal truths surrounding the elements in this show, which is not a bad thing by any means. It just leaves me wanting a little more from it. At number 34, we have Burning Down the Horse, which is a hilarious classic comedy by Fishing for Chips, where the audience finds themselves as part of a group of soldiers locked into the Trojan horse on the way to infiltrate Troy. This show was incredibly funny, a lot of really fantastic audience interactions, a very classic style of comedy reminiscent of a Monty Python, where you have these really funny, sometimes ridiculous bits combined with social commentary. This play dives into a look at power structures and these soldiers dealing with a general who doesn't really want to explain to them what's going on and what exactly are we fighting for here. And I love comedy that can simultaneously be just really funny but also have something to say at the root of it. There were definitely some bits that were a little too predictable too early on, and some bits that just never escalated enough for me. I do think that the jokes that land so incredibly well, but some of them just kind of fall flat and drag the rest of the show down. But overall, I really enjoyed this show and what it had to say and how it chose to say it, especially with the amount of audience interaction in this and these fantastic performances. At number 33, we have the new musical Barbara and Kenneth, which stars Diana Giulietti as Barbara, who is a woman who has done it all. She's had a million jobs, but people just really still love to comment on her appearance and how she dresses and her relationship to a man. Yes, this is loosely inspired by Barbie and Ken, but do not make any mistake, this has really nothing to do with the film or the doll herself, and has in fact been in development since long before the movie came out last year. The shining light of Barbara and Kenneth as a show is the star performance by Diana Giulietti, who, if you have never seen her, she is a TikTok influencer and is an incredible actress. And she really got to showcase that she is more than just an influencer in this show. She has a brilliant voice, was belting to the gods before noon every day of the Fringe, and really was able to capture the spirit of Barbara as a character, as this woman who can do it all but still has some insecurities. And the songs in this, written by Laws and Levitt, a new musical theater songwriting duo, really had a lot of Stephen Schwartz vibes to them. We had a lot of big belty ballads, some really fun, promising lyrics like why'd I have to go all the way to Australia just to find the words to tell ya? Which I love an imperfect rhyme when it's unexpected, and there was a lot of that in this show. The look at feminism and the writing of the book, also done by Lauren Laws, is where this show kind of fell apart a little bit for me, and where I think the development really needs to find its footing. Some of the discussions of feminism were a little heavy-handed and took away from this show actually having an interesting narrative. I wanted to like the characters and their relationship to each other a little more, because yes, Kenneth also makes an appearance in this show. It's written like a one-woman show, but I think all successful one-woman shows have a little more of a through line than this currently has right now. There's definitely a lot of potential here, and with Diana as the star, it made it an enjoyable watch overall, but I do think that this definitely needs development to find its footing if it continues on in the future. Also, some of the songs were a little too generic feminism for me, and I want them to be more specific to who Barbara is as a woman. And for a show that talks a lot about how much she is being judged for her appearance and her relationship, most of the songs ended up being about her appearance and her relationship. So it really needs to find a balance to not end up becoming what it is writing against, right? At number 32, we have the Emu War, which is a fantastic musical comedy from Australia. The Emu War was described to me as like the Australian Operation Mincemeat. It too, like Operation Mincemeat, is based off of a really bizarre piece of history where these veterans who came back from World War I were given land to farm, but as they were trying to grow this wheat, they were being overrun by emus who would eat the wheat seeds before they got a chance to germinate, essentially destroying all of their crops. The soldiers asked for help from the government, who essentially starts a war against these emus, complete with machine guns, and they lost to the birds. It's an absolutely insane piece of history that I think just makes a really, really, really fun musical. It's such a delightfully silly and true premise, and it has these incredibly heartfelt and really funny performances, especially by Lottie Pearl, who also wrote the show with Toby Little. The show also had some really great vocals, some really fun puppetry for the emus with like these really cute hand puppets, and the score is incredibly promising. However, the score's a little too slow right now. I think one of the things that Operation Mincemeat does well is Operation Mincemeat does have the heart. It does have the ballads. It does have the characters that you care about. But it also has a lot of really fun, upbeat moments that match the silliness of the premise. And I really think that Emu War needs to find that. It needs to speed up the show. There's too many ballads that could easily just be comedic numbers. Emu War also has trouble right now mixing the historical plotline with the fictional character relationships that provide the heart of the show. I definitely think it needs to develop some of those relationships a little more. As long as it can strike a balance in the overall tone and narrative being told here, this has the potential to be a great piece of theater in the future. But right now, the performances and the overall production quality of this really, really made it an enjoyable theater going experience for me. I cannot wait to see what happens to Emu War in the future. At number 31, we have Potty the Plant. This is the second year that Potty the Plant has come to Fringe. It is a dark musical comedy about Potty, a charming potted plant who lives in the office of Dr. Acula, who works at Boo Boo's Children's Hospital. And at this hospital, all of these children are mysteriously disappearing, and Dr. Acula, who may or may not be a vampire, may be the source. Who knows? A mystery needs to be solved, and Potty is on the case. This musical is just completely silly. It's got the vibes of like Little Shop of Horrors if Seymour was the plant. Some of the comedy vibes are also very much in the vein of like a Star Kid musical. You have these really silly, ridiculous bits, like this ongoing bit between the sun and the moon to show the passing of time. And it's got an incredibly upbeat score that has pop and rock influences in it. And in fact, you can listen to the score with this most recent run of The Fringe. They did also release a cast album of last year's cast. Now, some of the songs definitely went on just a little too long for me, and there were moments where I just wasn't invested in the plot. And definitely some of the comedy was just not in my vein of comedy, but I definitely found so many of these jokes to be really, really funny. There's a nice mix of humor, and I love when the show went to really dark and borderline inappropriate places. And I ultimately really loved where the show landed in the end. But there was definitely moments in the middle where I was like, where is this going? Maybe this is a little too immature for me, but I definitely ultimately thought it stuck the landing. Potty the Plant is also based off of a short film that they made prior to making this into a full-length Fringe show, and you can watch that 10-minute short online. And I actually liked the score in that a little bit more. I think that in expanding the songs, they just get a little too repetitive. But what you're missing in that short film version is a lot of the really fun bits that they've included in the longer stage version. At number 30, we have Bellringers, which is one of the more controversial shows that I saw. I saw this with a group of friends, and when I tell you, You either love or hate Bellringers. Bellringers is a new play by Daisy Hall that takes place in an apocalyptic future where this village is being ravaged by these storms. And the people of this village believe that the only way that they can continue to survive these storms is by sending volunteers into the church to ring the bells, and that the peals of the bells are going to clear the storms and prevent them from completely flooding them. And that is where we find our characters, in the bell tower of this church, waiting for the storm to approach so that they can ring the bells. However, as the storms keep getting worse and worse, as we're getting closer and closer, to the apocalypse, what has been happening is the volunteers have been getting electrocuted while holding on to the wet ropes attached to these bells at the top of this tower that are being struck by lightning. And that is essentially this play. It is Waiting for Godot with life or death stakes. And as somebody who finds absurd theater to be a little hit or miss, depending on, how much I can grasp the overall concept, I was so invested in this one. First, you had the great rapport between actors Paul Adeyefa and Luke Rollison, who played these two friends, and they really helped to carry the show and keep the energy up the entire time as these men are just waiting for this storm to arrive. And the script explored these really interesting existential ideas between, faith and science, and what are you willing to sacrifice for something that you believe in? And what are you willing to sacrifice for people that you love, even when their beliefs differ from your own? It explored some really, really interesting topics, and on top of the performances, just was enthralling from beginning to end for me. On top of that, when I saw this in the Roundabout Theater, which is essentially a tent that is pitched outside in like this tin can, there was also a lot of wind and rain happening outside of the actual theater that you could see like blowing the top of the tent while this show is happening, which combined with the sound design of the show led to this being a more immersive experience than it was probably intended to be, which just was also a lot of fun. Now, there were some of the more fantastical elements of this play that were a little hard to follow, and a lot of that I think was due to some of the design restraints that shows just face being in a fringe environment. I think this play would actually benefit a lot from having a larger scenic design budget and being staged in a more permanent theater space, because there was a lot of world building here, especially with the nature aspect of it. There were mushrooms that were appearing at random times that here were represented by like a light would show up. And I wasn't really entirely sure what that aspect of the play was trying to say. And I think overall the production would benefit from having that visual indicator of what exactly we're talking about there. But overall, I loved what this play is trying to explore, and I would love to see a full production of Bellringers in the future. Bellringers is one of the plays that I immediately bought the play script right after, because I would love to read exactly what is in the text and see how to do a full production of this in the future. At number 29, we have Things I Did While Waiting for You to Fall Back in Love With Me, a one-woman show written and performed by Sarah Hogewood that was described as the lesbian Hamlet. Now, the plot definitely differs a lot from Hamlet, as we follow one woman post-breakup from her ex-fiancé, as she's going through a series of chaotic phases of her mental state, from full-on denial that leads to her breaking into her ex-fiancé's apartment to a complete drug-induced meltdown. But similar to Hamlet, she's definitely going through an existential crisis that, if she doesn't handle it properly, could lead to her own self-destruction. Things I Did While Waiting for You to Fall Back in Love With Me is really brought to light by Sarah's performance. She is so electric and energetic on that stage from the moment that she enters the space. As soon as she's able to find her footing in the performance, she really helps to bring it to life. And the writing is just so hilarious and leads you to such unexpected places. And even though the show is so super specific to her experience as a heartbroken lesbian, and she explores, her own views of her lesbian identity and her own specific struggles with trying to get past this breakup, there's still enough of it that just feels so universal and so relatable. And being able to capture that relatability in a story that is so specific, I just think elevates the overall material. I do think, however, that the play does suffer a bit from being a one-woman show, and that this would benefit from from expanding the world. There were moments where Sarah was trying to juggle being more than one character, and I definitely think that there's one person shows where that kind of storytelling elevates the overall premise. This was not one of those, and in fact, I think that having her play so many characters ended up bringing down the overall story and having us focus less on her and her own existential crisis. I think ultimately the show would have benefited from either having a full cast or even one or two other people to play the additional characters that she interacts with. That way her specific through line would focus more on the existential crisis that she was going through that is more central to the narrative of this story, as opposed to also trying to figure out who she is trying to be in all of the different characters on stage. But Sarah is an incredibly funny writer and gifted performer, and I'm excited to see what she does in the future and if this story continues to develop, because I think there's a lot of promise here. I would love to see a more developed version of this show in the future. At number 28, we have 6 chick flicks, which is just what the title describes. It's a reenactment of 6 different chick flicks performed by Carrie Palma and KK Apple. Both of these women play all of the characters to reenact, of course, 6 chick flicks, including Titanic, The Notebook, Legally Blonde, Beaches, Dirty Dancing, and Pretty Women. And it is clear the enjoyment that these women get from watching these chick flicks, while they also skewer the more ridiculous aspects of the genre. Both of these actresses work so well together, and the humor is so quick and so sharp, but at the same time, the reenactments are clear enough that even if you are not familiar with the movie that they are reenacting, you still understand what is happening. I have never seen Beaches. I thought their Beaches reenactment was still just as funny as all of the 5 other films that I have seen. They do also infuse some social commentary into the reenactments, like talking about how Dirty Dancing is a movie about abortion, talking about how the male gaze has affected chick flicks. And some of that definitely felt incredibly necessary, but some of it was also just a little bit heavy-handed. And I wish that they'd also talked about the times that chick flicks transcend those stereotypes, especially when looking at a film like Legally Blonde, because Legally Blonde definitely has its ridiculous aspects to it, but it also transcended stereotypes, and they never really dive into that. There was definitely this ongoing bit about, oh, this film is written by a man, but not all of the films that they reenact were written by men, and yet they never acknowledged that both Legally Blonde and Dirty Dancing are written by women, and what exactly the differences between those are. It seemed like they only wanted to talk about the negative and never the positives about why we enjoy these films and what these films can sometimes do well. But overall, the reenactments were so sharp and so funny to watch. This was an incredibly enjoyable experience to me, even if I wanted a little bit more from it. At number 27, we have Heartbreak Hotel, which is a new piece of theater from New Zealand by theater group EBKM, written and performed by Karen McCracken, who plays a woman going through a devastating heartbreak as she takes you through the coping mechanisms that she develops, her rebounds, and the science of what is physically happening to the body during a heartbreak. And I love plays that combine our emotions and our relationships that feel so illogical with something as logical as the science behind them. Like, those are my jam. If you've ever seen Itamar Moses's Completeness, this is very much in that same vein. And this play has a beautiful progression of these scenes between Karen McCracken and Simon Leary, who plays all of the different men in her life, broken up by these dreamy lo-fi synth covers of classic heartbreak songs like Celine Dion's It's All Coming Back to Me Now. And I just thought that all of these aspects were combined beautifully. At number 26, we have Tennis, which is a hilarious piece of physical theater from Danish theater company Don Gnu. This entire show is an absurd reenactment of the 1980s Wimbledon match between Bjorn Borg and John McEnroe, and is hilariously brought to life by Yannick Eckner and Christopher Louis Andrup Peterson. The entire show is mostly nonverbal with the exception of a few key moments and the pre-show, where they are talking to the audience. But there is this pulsing score by Alice Carreri that provides the heartbeat to this performance. And when I say reenactment of this Wimbledon match, I mean very loose reenactment. This goes to very absurd and comical places. There are continuing bits that happen throughout this. Do not go in expecting an actual tennis match. There are bits where they're like actually moving the net on the stage. There are moments where they go into the audience and climb over audience members. There are recurring bits between the actual performers on stage and the stage manager who's running the sound cues, because of course there are no actual balls on this stage, but they use the sound effect of a tennis ball hitting the court. And there are definitely bits that go on a little too long. You're waiting for the next thing to happen. The pacing just feels a little bit off in the middle, but gosh, this was such a fun show all the way through to its kind of heartfelt ending. What a surprising piece of theater. I definitely feel like going into the Fringe, I was intimidated by the idea of physical theater because I was afraid that it was all going to be like This Is Not Romeo and Juliet, which I ended up seeing right after I saw Tennis. And I think that if I had seen that first, I don't know if I ever would have seen another piece of physical theater. But gosh, Tennis was just so funny and so entertaining, and a surprising delight of the Fringe. Next up at number 25, we have Diary of a Gay Disaster. Diary of a Gay Disaster is a blast of a new original musical comedy by Rebecca Mailer that follows Ellis, who is a lesbian who wakes up in this fever dream created by the gods of sapphic desire, and she's met by her two guardian angels. And together, the three of them, with this magical diary, work through some of the more embarrassing nuances of their own queer identities and experiences as sapphics. And Diary of a Gay Disaster was just so much fun. So much fun. I loved the score. The entire score felt reminiscent of like an early 2000s comedy. There were multiple genres. You had like pop punk songs. There was like a disco song in there. There was a country song, but it all had kind of like this bubblegum sheen to it that you get in like a teen comedy. Just the representation in this show, in a show with only 3 characters, mind you, felt so diverse and so encompassing of all of the different corners of sapphic identities. You had both lesbian and bisexual representation. You had women and non-binary sapphic representation. And there were songs that dived into those nuances and really unpacked them in ways that I have not seen on stage in this kind of a fun packaging before. Now, of course, there is the framing device of this being kind of in a dream world, and there are these angels, but the angels also have a relationship with each other, and we're not sure if they're actually also in the real life. And the framing device as a whole kind of didn't work for me and needs a little bit of reworking. And looking at the history of the show, it seems like that's kind of what they're trying to figure out still. Because I read about a previous production of the show where they were just all roommates that had moved in together, which I also don't necessarily think is the answer, but I don't think that the framing device as it is right now fully works. So it definitely still needs some development. I would also love this to be expanded out into a longer 90-minute show. There's so much good representation here. And anytime that we are able to see joyful queer representation that is specific to all of the nuances of queer identities, I'm all for it. I'm all for it, and that is absolutely what this show is. But Diary of a Gay Disaster is such a fun show. I hope to see more of this in the future, and I absolutely need a cast recording because the score is like really, really good. And number 24 is 1984, which is a production of 1984 put on by Within Theater, a group of Slavic actors from Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, who have used Nick Hearn's adaptation of the novel into a play as kind of like the base and really made it their own production. And so much of this production uses the text of 1984 to parallel what is currently happening in the political climate of Belarus, a country where in 2022 they banned 1984 from being sold in stores, and there are booksellers who are still imprisoned, as well as thousands of political prisoners being held for forms of peaceful protesting, like selling 1984. And the framing device of this adaptation of 1984 places us, the audience, in the prison, where O'Brien is having other criminals reenact all of Winston and Julia's crimes to us, the audience, as a kind of a warning, while the actual Winston is off to the side also watching all of this happen, which gives it this very interesting layer of like, we are seeing all of the crimes through the lens of the prison, which gives it this very interesting lens of we are watching all of these crimes happen and this narrative happen through the lens of the person in power. And so it gives us an extra sheen of like distrust, which I think is a very effective way to tell 1984 on stage. And keep in mind, 1984 has been adapted multiple times, and I do not think that I've seen a version of it as effective as this one. And not only do you have that framing device, but you also have behind the action projections happening that occasionally will have like quotes and facts of what is happening in Belarus right now that mirror what is happening on the stage, that give it a very chilling and very urgent aspect to this specific adaptation. I do think this production was ultimately weakened by some of the direction that was not in favor of the text. The framing device definitely worked, the adaptation definitely worked, but there were scenes that were staged on the ground really close to the audience as opposed to using the rest of the stage. And because of that, anybody who was not in that front row could not see what was happening. And especially when you also had cameras on stage, because, you know, how do you do 1984 without also having cameras on stage? I don't think that those cameras were used to help the fact that the audience could not see what was happening. And while some of the text elements that were being projected on the screen were definitely effective in contributing to the story, there was also image elements that I sometimes found more distracting than effective in telling the story. But I do think with a bigger budget and a better space to tell this in, this is such an effective adaptation of 1984 and really kind of what I was missing from previous 1984 adaptations that I've seen, especially when you are seeing these stories be told by people who have in their own sense been able to live this. I think it's such a vital story of being able to talk about what happens to power when it goes unchecked, and a perfect framing device for framing what is true and what is not to us, the audience. Number 23 is the delightful Tim Murray is Witches, which is a one-man stand-up cabaret performance told by Tim Murray, who many people may know from social media. And he has compiled into this one-man show stories of his childhood, stories of his interactions now as a teacher interacting with the children of today, and tying together all of the witches that have inspired him throughout his life, and all of the parallels between really loving these witches who were powerful and confident and yet were ostracized from society for being outsiders because the people just did not understand them, which of course has a ton of parallels to how we have treated queer people throughout history. And so it makes sense that Tim Murray would relate to witches so much. Every personal anecdote in this is incredibly funny. Tim's interactions with the audience are so well done. Every song is like a brilliant parody. There's a really great parody number of Poor Unfortunate Souls that he performs as Ursula, talking about women of a certain age and how they are viewed by the entertainment industry. Tim Murray's Witches just goes to a lot of really fun places. And the parallels in this work so incredibly well, especially when he ties them all back to witches finding their coven, because I think the idea of found family is so incredibly important, especially in the queer community. And Tim Murray really gets to showcase all of his skills as a performer. Not only is he incredibly charismatic and incredibly funny, but he's also an incredibly gifted improviser, not just in his interactions with the audience, but also he does an entire song that is improvised that is maybe one of the more impressive improvised musical numbers that I've seen. Any musical improv is incredibly hard to do, but he is very skilled at it. My only wish is I kind of wish it had more structure to it. I wish that more things tied in at the end, which they do, and especially with all the improv happening, there are a lot of tie-ins that are done very well. Sometimes I just felt like the show went on too many different tangents, but it was incredibly entertaining from start to finish. And if you get a chance to see Tim Murray perform at all, I would highly recommend it. He's a very gifted performer. And number 22 is Main Character Energy, which is a one-woman show written and performed by Temmie Wilkie. takes us on a journey of her entire life as we really get to see her learn to love herself and be the main character of her own story. And it goes into some surprising places. This show absolutely works because of Tummy Wilke's energy, because she does have that main character energy. It kind of would fall apart if she didn't. And it goes to incredibly vulnerable places as Temmie learns to reclaim her confidence that has been taken from her from aspects of society, especially as a dark-skinned Black woman who is constantly overlooked and not seen by others, especially people in power, as the main character. She makes us see her as the main character by reclaiming her story, but also doesn't shy away from talking about some of the more darker aspects of what does it mean to be a main character, and especially to be a main character in her body. She talks about the abuses that Francesca Amawuda Rivers faced after being cast as Juliet in the most recent West End production of Romeo and Juliet, and really explores, like, is it worth it to want that attention and to want to be the main character so much that you're willing to put up with that? And I really loved the places that she wasn't afraid to go to in this. I do think that the show needs to strike a little bit more of a balance of those darker places with the more comedic moments, but ultimately this was just such an enjoyable piece. At number 21, we have A Letter to Lyndon B. Johnson or God, Whoever Reads This First. And this new work by Chloe and Natasha follows essentially 3 different through lines. We have these Boy Scouts that are recounting, like, the best moments at their camp that they went to over the summer. We have them playing soldiers, and then we have one of them telling a fable of this boy who goes on a quest to become a man. And all of these through lines are, like, seamlessly woven together. We continuously jump from one through line to the other. We get a little piece of the story, and then we get an anecdote of what happened to them at camp, and then they're playing soldiers, and they're reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. And all of this has this incredibly childlike energy that Chloe and Natasha bring to these characters. They completely embody these boys and the innocence and the optimism and the joy that they have at recounting these tales, and how much fun that they have together. There is music interspersed that they play on the harmonica that are songs from the time period. And all of this explores the romanticization of the military to young boys. How playing soldiers feels like fun and games until actual war happens. And all of this is told so incredibly effectively that by the time we hit the landing, it just lands so well. The one thing, however, is I think this is one of the few shows that suffered from the fact that I was seeing it at Fringe surrounded by so many other shows. Because of how quick and how fast this show was and how many things were taking place at once, it required a lot of brain energy that when I saw this show, I did not have at the time. I was exhausted. I was sleep deprived. I had seen, like, I don't know, 5 other shows that day. So there were times when all of the different through lines were hard to follow. We would go back to this boy on a quest and I would be unsure of what happened previously in the story. And so I would lose the narrative and feel like I was missing something. And there is so much to catch in this because of just how seamlessly it is written. I want to go back and see this when it's like maybe one of 2 shows I see in a day, because the message that this play has to say is incredibly profound and important. I just felt like I was missing it in the moment. But Chloe and Natasha are such exciting theater makers. They have won awards at Fringe the last 2 years that they've been. This is now their 3rd year in a row. This is the first that I've seen of their work, but I'm definitely going to keep following their work from now on because they are incredibly exciting theater makers. They have a history in clowning and commedia, and they bring that physicality to their performances here. And it was so satisfying to see where this show ended up. And it perfectly leads me into the top 20 that are all the 5-star shows of the Fringe. These were all incredibly entertaining shows, not necessarily perfect pieces of theater, but theater that successfully was doing what it was trying to do. I had a blast at all 20 of these, and the fact that there were 20 shows that I considered to be 5 stars during my time at the Fringe is incredible. I never have that high of percentage of 5-star shows when I see shows on Broadway or in the West End. Some truly exciting work happening at the Fringe Festival, and the future of theater is bright. Let's dive into them. Starting at number 20 is Tin Can Bros' Solve It Squad. Now, Tin Can Bros is an offshoot of Star Kid, created by 3 Star Kid members to create their own theater company. So a lot of the humor falls very much into that same vein, and Solve It Squad is a parody of Scooby-Doo that takes place essentially 20 years after the Mystery Gang solved their last mystery as teenagers. And like any really good parody, Solve It Squad not only relies on some of the tropes that are familiar to the Scooby-Doo series, but also is able to stand on its own as just a really funny piece of theater. The jokes were incredibly funny, and the challenge of parodying something, especially like Scooby-Doo, where every episode kind of follows the same formula, you have to, on one hand, still rely on that formula and be familiar enough that fans will be able to recognize the formula, but you also want to surprise the audience, and they absolutely do that in this show. You also get some great character work from these actors and some great physical comedy. And the standout absolutely is Brian Rosenthal, who essentially plays the entire ensemble of characters that the Solve It Squad interacts with and has entire scenes by himself and is able to balance all of those characters, but also infuse some of the humor of how ridiculous it is that he is playing all of these characters just in an incredibly successful and hilarious sequence. Now, they have filmed previous productions of this show. You can watch it on YouTube under the name Solve It Squad Returns. But like with any show that you see a pro shot of, it's just so much fun to see it in person. And this entire cast really knocked it out of the park. And out of all of the comedies that I saw at the Fringe, especially that leaned into parody, this was definitely one of the more successful ones. At number 19, we have Kafka's Metamorphosis, the musical with puppets, that, like the title suggests, is a musical retelling of Kafka's Metamorphosis that frames both the life of Franz Kafka with his own novella, The Metamorphosis. And that framing device of bringing in elements of his own life with this story all about this man who wakes up to find himself as an insect and unable to communicate with his family. The parallels between the two really helped this show hit the emotional notes that it needed to. Music-wise, there was a lot of Dave Malloy influences in this score. They have released a cast recording that you can listen to from previous productions. And while I don't necessarily think I'm going to listen to any of these songs on their own, they worked really well in the context of this musical. And all 4 of the performers in this show were absolutely fantastic, especially Blake DuBois, who played both Franz Kafka and Sam Gregor within the narrative of The Metamorphosis, and was the primary puppeteer of this show. And the way that he was able to perform both of these characters with a perfect blend of sadness and humor, because the show was incredibly funny. The entire show itself just totally found the perfect balance between sardonic and being surprisingly moving. And that can be incredibly tough to find, but this found the balance perfectly. This show was incredibly funny, and yet still by the end of it, I was moved to tears. At number 18, we have To Free a Mockingbird, a one-woman show written and performed by Grace Aki. Now, full disclosure, this is the 4th time that I have seen To Free a Mockingbird. I do personally know Grace and have seen her develop this show, but I think it's also just a profoundly successful piece of storytelling. In To Free a Mockingbird, Grace tells 3 different stories of 3 generations of her family, including her own, and each generation's story with love as well as loss. This is an incredibly vulnerable piece from the moment that Grace enters the theater to the heartbreaking final moments of this show. And that vulnerability is really what helps this show to successfully land when it needs to. And one of the things I love about To Free a Mockingbird is this exploration that Grace takes us on into the stories that we tell about our families and how our perceptions of loved ones are changed based off of the stories that we are telling and the stories that we choose to tell of those family members. This show is so raw and it can be incredibly uncomfortable at times, but it's also incredibly moving. And every time I leave this show, I am one, in tears, and two, just want to reach out and talk to family members, which I think is a beautiful way to leave your audience at the end. At number 17 is the hilarious Diva Live from Hell starring Luke Bayer. Now, Diva Live from Hell is this hilarious cabaret performance that this theater teen who has died and gone to hell is being forced to perform on a loop as his punishment. And this cabaret recounts all of the events that led him to his ultimate demise. This entire show is like if Oh Mary and Dear Evan Hansen had a demonic child. And Luke Bayer absolutely gets to shine in this production. He not only, of course, plays Desmond Channing, who is the flamboyant theater teen who's putting on this cabaret for us, but he also embodies all of the different characters, including like Evan, the new jock who has come to town and has decided to audition for the school musical. He also plays Desmond's mousy stage manager friend who is incredibly shy, and the adults in Desmond's life. And every single character is just performed so distinctively and has such hilarious quirks to them. And on top of all of that character work, he's performing these incredibly lively cabaret numbers written by Nora Bridget Monahan and Alexander Sage Oyen. There's full-on dance numbers, there's costume changes, and the entire show is just non-stop, with the exception of like 10 minutes near the end where it kind of loses its momentum just a little bit. But the overall performance was just so brilliantly done. And yes, there is a cast recording of this as well, where you can hear all of the brilliant performances that Luke Bayer is giving in this. At number 16 is the absolutely hilarious My Last Two Brain Cells, where we, the audience, find ourselves as hormones on the tour of Gary's brain. And while this tour is taking place, Gary experiences some sort of traumatic event that leaves him essentially in a coma, and all that is left are the last two brain cells and all of these hormones. And these brain cells have to figure out how to essentially reset Gary before he goes brain dead. This show was hilarious from start to finish and is really brought to life by the two performers. You have Joe Pike, who plays the voice of reason. He's kind of uptight. He is the logical brain cell in this duo. And then on the other side of this neurological odd couple, you have Tom Hazelton playing the chaotic head of the immaturity department. Both actors have incredible chemistry with each other, but they also were fantastic at all of the audience interactions in the show because, of course, it's a Fringe show and audience interactions are kind of the staple. But not only do you have their performance, you also have the performance by the stage manager that did a really great job with the timing of some sound cues, and all three of their ability to improv and to play off of how the audience was reacting to the show was just so incredibly well done. And the entire show was this great mix of bits that never felt like they were getting old, but also were able to be beautifully tied together by the end of the show. And I love comedy with really successful callbacks, and this one nailed it. At number 15, we have Same Team, which is a piece of theater made in collaboration with Street Soccer Scotland that follows a team of women that are selected for the Homeless Women's World Cup, which is absolutely a real thing that I did not know about before this show. The Homeless World Cup is a tournament that happens every year. There's both men and women's divisions where teams across the world of homeless players come together to play to raise awareness for homelessness across the world. And I love theater that brings light on facets of representation that we don't ever see or talk about. And in the play itself, we have all of these 5 women coming from different circumstances, different things that have led to their homelessness. And we get to see them come together to learn to work on the same team. Hey, the performances in this play were absolutely fantastic. You also had some of the best design of any of the shows that I saw at Fringe. Granted, this production was previously done at Traverse last winter. It's a play that they have helped develop. And so it did kind of have the benefit of that, and you could see it on stage. And I also thought Same Team very effectively staged all of the soccer sequences. Similar to Dear England out of London and The Wolves out of the US, this really was able to find how thrilling live sports can be and capture that for the stage. At number 14, we have Half Man, Half Bull Part 1, Theseus. Half Man, Half Bull was a piece of theater broken up into 2 different parts, Theseus as Part 1 and Daedalus as Part 2. And both of them were sold as separate tickets. You could see them back to back. You could see them on different days. You could only see one, and they were their own full, complete stories. Now, the first half took rap and rock and folk-inspired music and spoken word to reenact the story of Theseus as he went to the labyrinth, killed the Minotaur, and escaped with Ariadne, the princess. In using this myth, it explored the relationship between parent and child through the lens of the child and all of the expectations that these children have had placed on them by society, by their parents. Theseus spends so much of the show trying to live up to the expectations put on by his father. Ariadne ends up spending the show trying to escape the expectations placed on her by her father. And by taking that point of view, it breathes new life into this very classic piece of Greek mythology. Half Man, Half Bull as a piece is also written by Wright and Granger, who previously did The Gods, The Gods, The Gods. And anybody who's familiar with that piece knows that it definitely blends in a lot of music and a lot of spoken word, and it does so very successfully. It's such a fresh form to musical theater as a whole, and this entire show was told in the round. It kind of felt partly like a concert, partly like you were just sitting around a campfire, and the entire show just felt so intimate but also fresh and modern for a piece of ancient mythology. And number 13 is Pop Off Michelangelo, a new musical by Dylan Markarel. This show was so funny and had one of my favorite new scores. We have Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, who are childhood friends, who realize that they're gay, but however, being gay is a sin according to the church. And so they decide that they are going to become famous artists to get commissioned by the church so that they can ask for divine forgiveness from God for being gay. It's an absolutely ridiculous premise that is then infused with like some of the funniest references to gay pop culture and musical theater, and any musical that is able to reference Diana the Musical and Sunday in the Park with George in the same song is good in my book. I would love to get a full 2-act version of this show, but this version at Fringe just felt on its own like such a complete and brilliant piece of theater. And getting a cast recording for this is not a want but a need, if only to get the title song out of my head. Pop Off Michelangelo. At number 12 is another hilarious musical, One Man Musical by Flo and Joan. One Man Musical is a brilliant parody show where Andrew Lloyd Webber, after writing a series of flops, has decided to write his own bio musical about his life to perform at the Fringe. The concept already brilliant, and then the writing of these songs was so incredibly funny and smart. And this has an original score, and Flo and Joan really have captured what makes Andrew Lloyd Webber shows sound like Andrew Lloyd Webber shows, and written a completely original score around them, complete with hilarious reprises, all the way down to the mega mix that they play at the end of the show. And all of this is brought to life by George Fouracres, who perfectly embodies the energy of Andrew Lloyd Webber without ever doing an Andrew Lloyd Webber impression. He just has the perfect energy to play an absolutely chaotic and heightened Andrew Lloyd Webber character. And even though this show is a complete parody of Andrew Lloyd Webber, he just feels incredibly over the top from the actual person. The entire life story relayed in this show is accurate, which makes this all the more funnier. This is the perfect show for anybody that like just loves musical theater and loves to hate Andrew Lloyd Webber, because it embodies everything that we love about his scores but hate about the person into one brilliantly funny show. At number 11, and maybe one of the biggest surprises of the Fringe, is Swamplesque, which is in fact a burlesque show inspired by the entire first Shrek film. You would not think that burlesque and Shrek go together, but oh, they do. This is a burlesque show from Australia that essentially breaks the entire first Shrek film into separate burlesque acts. You have drag performers, you have live vocalists, you have the magic mirror on roller skates lip syncing to a mashup of multiple covers of Man in the Mirror. You have Gingy doing a striptease of their limbs to Loosen Up by My Buttons by the Pussycat Dolls. This entire show was completely chaotic and surprising from start to finish. And yet, beneath the surface of this incredibly entertaining burlesque show, you have them taking a movie like Shrek, which is a kid's film all about these outsiders in the fairy tale world who are able to come together and stick it to the powers that be, despite being called monsters and freaks, and learning to embrace their differences that others see as ugly. I'm gonna cry. And they take that and they break it up into a burlesque show that is being performed by drag performers, queer performers, there's kink representation, and there is the most body diverse cast I have ever seen on stage, maybe ever, let alone in a burlesque show, where performers are specifically showing off their bodies. And the parallels of those are just so perfect, and I love any work of art that seems frivolous, like a kids movie or a burlesque show, that ends up having such a beautiful, deeper meaning to it, because I think art can be incredibly entertaining, but also incredibly important. And Swamplesque surprisingly absolutely is. And with that, we have finally entered the top 10. And when I tell you ranking the top 10 was so incredibly difficult, literally any of these could be number one. In my heart, this is just a 10-way tie. I mean, honestly, it's probably a 12-way tie, because I think Swamplesque and One Man Musical are on par with any of these top 10 shows. I set myself to a ranking, and therefore I'm sticking to it. But any of these top 10 shows, if you get a chance to see them, I cannot recommend them enough. This truly is the future of theater, and it is so exciting, and it's beautifully queer. I think out of the top 10 of these, like 50% of them were queer, including number 10, Dylan Mulvaney's FAGHAG. This is Dylan Mulvaney's new one-woman show. If you don't know Dylan Mulvaney, what rock have you been living under? But she is a trans woman who has, for the past 4 years, been documenting her transition on TikTok, gained a huge following in the millions, was thrust into the spotlight, and ultimately started facing a lot of backlash. And all of that is in her one-woman show that has a sheen of the whimsical, as she starts as a literal angel, not only guiding you to your seat, but then jumping into the show as being sent down into her newest life by God. Takes us through her childhood, through her time identifying as a twink, and then finally becoming the woman that she is today. Now, Dylan Mulvaney has always been a musical theater performer, and it is so beautiful to see her at home on stage where she belongs, and getting to see her tell her own story in her own packaging on her terms was just so fulfilling. The musical is fantastical. There's, of course, audience interaction because it's a Fringe show, but honestly, I would like to see more audience interaction in full-length shows, because I think it's such an effective way to bring the audience into a story. And what really makes this piece so special is the way that Dylan is able to talk about her own identity and the nuances in her identity of being a trans woman and what womanhood means to her. And I think especially with queer identities, it's not just one thing. And as a non-binary person who still identifies with the aspect of womanhood that they were raised in, I found something so personal about the way that Dylan is able to talk about her own identity with that specificity that I think is incredibly important for audiences to understand, especially when talking about actual trans lives. And you also had this entire performance brilliantly directed by Tim Jackson, who also recently directed Two Strangers in the West End. And the direction, including the audience's interactions, really fun video elements, and some really fun video and audio cameos from people that have made a profound impact on Dylan's life and her transition, all really helped to bring this incredibly uplifting piece of theater that was really fun to watch, but also incredibly important. In case it's unclear, I love when theater can be both entertaining and joyous, but also important, because I don't think those things are mutually exclusive, and Dylan Mulvaney's show strikes the perfect balance. I would love to see this live on beyond the Fringe. I think there's room to expand this even more, but gosh, as a 60-minute show, this really was perfect to me from start to finish. It left me wanting more, and I hope we do get more. At number 9, we have I'm Almost There, which was an Audible commission, written and performed by Todd Almond, directed by David Cromer. And this follows one man's odyssey to open himself to love, as he is stopped by an increasingly bizarre cast of characters who stand in his way. It loosely follows Homer's The Odyssey, but like I'm talking really loosely here. I thought the show was perfectly paced. The entire narrative is equal parts whimsical and and yet incredibly relatable. And the score feels like a cross between Jason Robert Brown and Dave Malloy. There's a lot of the recitative nature in the lyrics that Dave Malloy likes to do a lot. A lot of the piano parts felt very reminiscent of Jason Robert Brown's scores, and you mix them together and you get one of my favorite scores of The Fringe. Thankfully, this is an Audible commission, so we should be able to hear this performance in full on Audible in the future. But I just loved the melodies, and the lyrics in this were beautifully poetic. One of my favorite lyrics was, "What we want is in our silence, not our words," which just hits. The entire narrative style is definitely not for everybody. This does go to some rather abstract places, but I loved it. It made me think, it kept me entertained, and again, I need a cast recording immediately. At number 8, we have Shit Theater, or What's Left of Us. Rebecca Biscuit and Louise Mothersole essentially put on a sing-around for the entire audience, and they framed this by talking about the time that they attended their first sing-around at a folk club that then a few days later ended up burning down, and the loss of that folk club ends up being a conduit for talking about a greater loss that they have experienced in their personal lives. And the way that they were able to tell this story of grief through this community setting and really have the audience be part of that catharsis and that healing was just so incredibly moving. And the way that they wrote this and how the story unfolded as the show went on, and how they were able to peel back the layers and show us the most vulnerable parts of their healing process, overall made Or What's Left of Us such a successful theater going experience. And then on top of that, they hosted a sing-around in a public setting for the entire audience after the show. And unfortunately, because of how tight I scheduled everything, I was unable to attend that. But I think being able to end such a community-driven piece with actually bringing that community together makes this just such a really beautiful piece of theater. Number 7 is My Mother's Funeral, a new play by Kelly Jones. And this is such a beautiful piece of theater where we are following a playwright who, after her mother dies, in order to pay for her mother's funeral, she is going to have to write a new play. And so she writes a play about a playwright having to pay for her mother's funeral by writing a play. This play is truly one of the best uses of meta storytelling and brilliantly captures the struggle of the working class in a work that analyzes what is the cost of turning your loved ones into art and what gets lost in that adaptation. How important is it that when we write personal experiences that we make it accurate to what we experienced, or how much can we color for an audience? Also, similar to Free a Mockingbird, My Mother's Funeral also dives into how are our perceptions of loved ones colored by our own personal experiences with them. And then on top of that, how does the art that we create end up capturing those people, and how do they live on in our art? And how do we want them to live in our art? This raises a lot of existential questions about art, which I really loved and appreciated. And then, of course, it was just so beautifully meta. I don't know if Kelly Jones had to pay for her own mother's funeral, and ultimately, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to me, an audience member, how much of this is real and how much isn't, because what is successful about Kelly Jones's play, and what ultimately I think is successful about the play within the play, is that it successfully moves the audience and it successfully tells the parts that it wants to tell. It has us thinking about why is something like a funeral so expensive? And it has us thinking about the ways that we celebrate life after it happens. And I think the play does that successfully. And whether or not it's based off of a true story, ultimately beautifully doesn't matter, because we're able to relate it to our own true stories. My Mother's Funeral is one of those plays that reminds you of why you love theater so much. Just so good. At number 6, we have Weather Girl, which is a new play written by Brian Watkins. And this entire play is one monologue as this very chipper weather girl takes us through an increasingly chaotic series of events as wildfires are raging in California. At its heart, Weather Girl is a climate change play that feels ridiculous and absurd and completely out there. And you're like, what is happening? Who is this weather girl who's, an alcoholic and horrible to people around her? And while you are being distracted by all of the noise that she is bringing, the direction of this play has us gradually getting closer and closer to essentially the apocalypse. Julie McDermott just perfectly captures the energy required for a weather girl, and she is able to go through all of the sequences in this play with that same level of energy from start to finish. And Tyne Raffaelli's direction of this really is what drives this piece home for me, because while everything that is happening in this monologue is chaotic and you aren't sure of where it's going, slowly and surely through the design elements, we see the culmination of our own personal distraction and where simply being a bystander is going to end up leading us in the future. Overall, a brilliant piece of theater that is beautifully performed and directed. At number 5, we have Every Brilliant Thing, which is a production of the play, both written and directed by Duncan Macmillan and starring Johnny Donahue. Now, this play is an older play. This was written about a decade ago and has been performed regionally in theaters across the world. But Every Brilliant Thing was new to me, and I'm so glad I finally saw it. This play follows a narrator who, after their mother attempts to take her own life, they begin to write down a list of every brilliant thing that they can think of. And this is a numbered list that they go back to at various moments in their life. And those moments can be good, those moments can be times of struggle, but it's a list that they just keep going back to remind themselves of all of the brilliant things that are worth living for. Just the premise alone is already so incredibly moving. But on top of that, you have some of the best use of audience participation I've seen in a play, where prior to the start of the show, Johnny Donahue went through the audience and talked to members of the audience to give them cards of items on this list. And so every time he would say a number, the person with that number would then say the item. Just a brilliant use of bringing the audience into the show. And there were also moments where Johnny would have people in the audience play different people in his life. I personally played one of the roles in this show, and I absolutely loved how before the show even started, Johnny Donahue went through and asked everybody, would you be okay playing a part in this? And got consent from everybody to be a part of the show, which especially in a show where he's putting people on the spot to improvise, I think is such an incredibly important thing for shows that have audience participation to do. But just the way that this show takes the concept of audience participation and these things that are on a list and combines them to essentially showcase that it's not just about these things that make life worth living, but also about the people around us. It's just such a beautiful message. And this entire show just felt like such a warm hug. And it had one of my favorite needle drops. And the fact that I can't even stop crying about it while talking about it should tell you just how successful this show is on its own. So good. Speaking of shows that I cannot stop crying about, at number 4, we have Rob Madge's My Son's a Queer. I have wanted to see this show for so long. I was so excited when they announced it was coming to Broadway, and then it didn't come to Broadway, and I was devastated. So to finally get to see them perform this show at the Fringe, that alone just already meant so much to me. My Son's a Queer is a one-person show written and performed by Rob Madge with additional songs by Pippa Cleary, and it talks about Rob Madge's childhood and their time as a kid putting on Disney parades for their entire family. And during this show, we also get to see home movies that Rob's family took of these very same parades, as well as other interviews and performances that Rob did as a child. And this entire show becomes a way for Rob to talk about how supportive their family was and how much they nurtured their own queer identity and how important that was for them, that when they went out into the world and were faced with people who were not nearly as loving, they still were able to feel that love at home, and how vital that is for our children, especially queer children, to feel that love at home and to feel that safe space. Because without that, Rob would not have been able to reach their full potential and to become themselves. It's so beautifully heartwarming. You have Rob Madge, who is a fantastic performer, getting to tell their own story. And as a non-binary person myself, I think this is, Any sort of non-binary representation, especially being written and performed by non-binary people, is vital to get more people to understand all of the nuances in gender identities that live outside of the binary. My Son's a Queer was just such an incredibly moving piece of theater, and I truly think it's the kind of theater that would make the world a better place. At number 3, we have Burnout Paradise, which is a new piece of theater by Ponycam, a Australian theater company. And while audience participation is definitely a trend at Edinburgh Fringe, no other show took it to the levels that Burnout Paradise does. Burnout Paradise takes 5 performers. 4 of them are trying to complete tasks within an allotted amount of time, all while simultaneously running on treadmills. And there are all of these different tasks that they set up at the beginning of the show as wanting to complete, like filling out a grant application, doing a piece of performance art, completing tasks off of a checklist, and cooking a 3-course meal from 2 audience participants. And then the 5th member times them as they are trying to complete these tasks. And as they set up at the beginning of the show, if they do not complete these tasks, everybody in the audience gets a refund. So already, within the first 5 minutes, they have set the stakes for the show incredibly high, but they have also given the audience a reason to not participate in the show, because every single one of these tasks requires audience participation in order to succeed. The combination of having stakes where the audience benefits from them not succeeding in their tasks, relying on the audience to succeed in those tasks, and trying to do all of these things at once is such a fascinating and brilliant way to explore burnout culture in our society. I could talk about this play for forever. I think it's a brilliant concept. The execution is highly entertaining, and as somebody with ADHD, there was always something really fascinating that was going on, and you as the audience could participate as much or as little as you wanted to in this show. Of all of the shows I saw, this was probably the most successful at feeling like a Fringe show. I don't think the show could live outside of the Fringe environment, but it was also such a unique piece of theater that I loved it from start to finish. I had a blast. It is one of the shows that I wish I could go revisit tomorrow. At number 2, we have Half Man, Half Bull, Part 2, Daedalus. Similar to the Theseus part, Daedalus also focused on the parent-child relationship through the lens of a piece of Greek mythology, this time focusing on the Icarus myth. But instead of from the child's perspective, we now see this relationship through the lens of the parent, Daedalus. And this half also explores themes of grief and the grief that we carry with us. Everybody knows the myth of Icarus and how, after being imprisoned, Daedalus and Icarus try to escape using handmade wings, and Icarus flies too close to the sun and ends up drowning. This performance ends up focusing on the grief and the guilt that Daedalus carries after that incident. Like Theseus, it also uses music that combines rap and rock and folk influences, and also mixes that communal sort of storytelling. There was also a really fun aspect of the Daedalus section that had the audience creating paper airplanes. That I thought was such a brilliant way to take the audience into this very joyous state of mind, very childlike, very hopeful. It was such a communal experience to get to play with each other for a moment. That made the devastation of what happened afterwards hit that much harder. And I thought that was a very effective way to take us into Daedalus's state of mind of experiencing that hope of being able to free themselves with his son to what then happens afterwards. There was also a beautiful blend of modern communication elements in this piece as well, where following the fall, we got to hear recounts of what happened as though they were being told by onlookers through a news broadcast or a radio broadcast. And I thought that was such an effective way to make this mythological story feel incredibly modern. I really loved both parts of this story. Obviously, I gave them both 5 stars, but I just felt like Daedalus was so much more innovative in its storytelling methods and effective in how it manipulates the emotions of the audience to help to feel the things happening in this story. And finally, number 1 was Cyrano. The way that I almost skipped this show entirely because I just don't like Cyrano as a story. It follows, of course, Cyrano de Bergerac, who feels like he is incredibly ugly because of his abnormally large nose, and is in love with the beautiful Roxanne, who he thinks is incredibly shallow, who herself is in love with Christian, an incredibly handsome man who does not have a intelligent bone in his body. And so Cyrano and Christian team up to win the heart of Roxanne, where Cyrano writes love poems for Christian to give to her. So she thinks that he's incredibly intelligent, and the two of them go off and get married, and you know, that's the original story. Now, this adaptation of Cyrano done by Virginia Gay takes that essentially framework of a story and pulls it apart and puts it beautifully back together. In Virginia Gay's Cyrano, we have Cyrano played by Virginia Gay, a woman. And in addition, of course, to Roxanne and Christian, we also have a Greek chorus of 3. And the members of this Greek chorus talk through as though we, the audience, are already familiar with Cyrano as a play. You have one member of the chorus who is a classically trained actor and loves the classics and wants Cyrano to be done as it is traditionally being told. You have another member of the Greek chorus who is not necessarily a fan of the classics and, you know, very much in my headspace of maybe there's some things that we can fix about it. And then you have our third member of the Greek chorus who is just happy to be there and acts as a conduit for the other 2 members to explain what is happening to members of the audience who may not necessarily be familiar with the source material. Already, this is an incredibly effective framework to breathing new life into this adaptation. And this Greek chorus also acts kind of like the Greek chorus in Legally Blonde. They talk directly to Cyrano. They interact with her directly as a character and help her to kind of talk through some of the thought process in what she should or should not do. I think this adaptation also gives Roxanne a little more agency and twist the entire ending on its head. But mostly what I love about this show is how joyous and how joyously queer it is. This adaptation to Cyrano is very much to me what Fat Ham is to Hamlet. It takes what is originally a tragic story with not necessarily the most lovable characters and infuses it with joy and love, and not only a love for humans and a love for community, but also just a love for theater. And even though the design was incredibly minimal, this production with the writing and the cast and the direction could go to Broadway tomorrow and feel at home. Cyrano as a whole was just such a pleasant delight and surprise of a production, and really reminds me how good adaptation can be. Anyway, that was all 49 different shows that I saw at the Fringe. I really hope to see more of these shows, especially from some of the works that are more in development. There was so much promising pieces of theater that I was able to catch, and really the fact that I loved more than half of them really cemented the fact that I'm gonna have to just go to Edinburgh Fringe every year for the rest of my life. If you are a theater lover, I cannot recommend making a trip at least once in your life. Sometimes I can get really pessimistic when I see a lot of commercial theater that I feel like isn't adding to the art form at all. And there is no better cure for that than going to the Edinburgh Fringe and seeing what the future of theater looks like, because it is bright. And getting to see all of this theater that was beautifully queer, had great representation, really pushed the form of storytelling as a whole, just really filled me with optimism. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Again, my name is Kate Reinking. If you haven't already, I would love if you liked this video. And if you went to the Fringe and saw a piece of theater that you loved, please drop it in the comments, especially if I did not see it. I'm constantly looking for new works of theater to see, and a lot of these works at the Fringe are going to have lives beyond the Fringe. And in fact, some of these you can already see doing encore performances in London, in New York, and supporting this kind of theater will only ensure that we continue to have theater this exciting in the future. And if you would like to see more about my entire 30-day long marathon of seeing as much theater as possible, where I also visited Fringe, then definitely check out this compilation of every single TikTok that I made while traveling. I love theater! Bye!